Why the interest in ceremonial ayahuasca?
It's a great question. And there's kind of two threads to that. There has been a renaissance in work on psychedelics. So sort of serotonin-based or serotonergic psychedelics, especially psilocybin, because that's really been used in the more recent research. And there's a paper that came out that looked at looked at psilocybin, mystical experience, and a personality trait called openness to experience. So the idea was that, this is up at Hopkins, and the woman who did it was Catherine McLean, who's awesome. And she did a study where people took psilocybin, put on a face mask, listen to tunes for a while. You always have a therapist with you, a social worker or something. And many of these people had mystical experiences, and those who do experience a change in their personality. They became more open to experience, which is a term we use to describe sort of an interest in art, creativity, philosophy, more intellectual pursuits. So it's
like coming online.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it.
Well, yeah.
That is a really good way to put it. And I've never thought about it that way, but it's great. So what got me was, wow, first people are studying psychedelics again. That's cool. And the other thing and they're finding mystical experience, and it's a sort of an academic descendant of William James, who wrote the Varieties of Religious Experience, 100 years ago. I'm like, the religious experience is fascinating. And then they found personality change, and personality change is something we just don't see a lot in the world. Therapy can kind of change people, make them less neurotic, but sort of this rapid, or sometimes people call quantum, personality change is just rare. So I looked at those things and went, this is fascinating. These psychedelics can change people's personality. That's really interesting. So that was the psychedelic side. And then the shamanic side is just, throughout my life, I like to do sort of, I guess you call it expedition, fly fishing and surfing. And so I've hung out with a lot of indigenous groups. I've traveled in Mongolia. I've traveled in Indonesia and the Mentawais near Siberut, met the shaman there. I've, been to Peru. So I've just met a lot of indigenous people and done ceremonies, not even psychedelic, but just general, kava or coca or juniper, whatever the substance is. And really been interested in that way of life and found it to be quite profound. I mean, especially my experiences in Mongolia, on horseback for a few weeks. But other places, just this profound insight in the nature of life that we just don't have. The idea that everything is connected is maybe a way to put it. And probably as a young person, the first time I experienced that was I was in Kenya, and this is probably the 80s. And I was riding on horseback with a Maasai guide named Ken Njui. I remember the whole thing. It was so profound, riding through a herd of, zebras and giraffes, and we're on horseback. And, he's got a big gun just in case. But
I want to be you in the 80s.
It's just so, but you see those places where the animals, you're just part of nature. And I've experienced, you can see this in some like tropic islands, like in Kiribati, which is you never go to Kiribati unless you're, fishing for bonefish or something. But if you go down to Christmas Island, you can go on these islands in the Pacific where they don't have people, and you can just walk with the birds, and they're everywhere. They're not scared of you. So you can have these experiences. So I was sort of interested in, shamanism from that, and interested in the psychedelics. And then, obviously you put those two together and it's ceremonial ayahuasca. So ayahuasca is a very powerful psychedelic. I mean, it includes this powerful psychedelic DMT, and it's used in ceremonial ways. So I was interested in that. Didn't know much about it, and then met a dude who's a shaman. And so we talked about it. I'm like, well, tell me about this. And he tells me about it. I go, well, that sounds a little silly to me, but these psychedelics sound pretty powerful. Let's study this and see what happens. And as long story short, as I started studying, I'm like, oh, this isn't silly at all. This is quite profound. I was kind of a knucklehead for dismissing it at first. So anyway, that's how I got into it. It was both the interest in psychedelics and the interest in shamanism, and they're different things. I mean, the psychedelic medicine that's going on now isn't the same as shamanic medicine. So anyway,
but how cool to marry these two different worlds. And now the way that I see it, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that these substances are being studied from an academic perspective to determine whether or not they have lasting effects on personality, which is so, so, so cool. Yet for centuries, these same substances, or the organic version of these substances, has been used in holy ceremonies to connect with the divine. And so you've got these two like lanes of study that, to me, I get chills just thinking about it. But what if anxiety really could be solved by this substance? And part of the reason the anxiety is solved is because there's this experience where you connect with what you feel like is a higher power that connects you to everybody else. I mean, it's for anybody that hasn't experienced it, it probably sounds insane, but it is such a profound journey.
Yeah. So, what you're saying is what got me interested is the idea that the mystical experience, this idea of sort of connecting with the divine or connecting with something greater than yourself, that's really hard to explain. That's part of the definition of mystical experiences, that they're ineffable. You can't really just say, here's what it is and show it to somebody. But that experience can actually lead to this positive change in personality, whether you become more open or you become less neurotic or less anxious or less depressed or less fearful. But that mystical experience is the healing process. And that's something we don't use as much in psychology. But if you go back historically, back to the more psychoanalytic people, especially Carl Jung, he was doing this. And so so one example is the history of Alcoholics Anonymous. So in Alcoholics Anonymous was started by a guy named Bill W., who's an alcoholic. He couldn't break the cycle. He talked to Carl Jung. He read William James. He tried to understand how to change. He couldn't do it. Finally, he had a mystical experience. And that mystical experience is what allowed him to overcome his addiction. And Jung said, yeah, it's spirit versus spirit. The alcohol is a spirit, the mystical is a spirit. I mean, he said it in Latin because he's young and he's smarter than me. Certainly of spiritus contra spiritus or something. But basically the idea was you need this mystical experience to kind of get over yourself. And so Bill W. in AA became a proponent of LSD, which is, people don't know, but it's like, he's like, well, this LSD magic, can induce mystical experiences in people pretty readily. Like half the people, third the people, it's not so hard. But then other people are like, well, you can't cure people's addiction with another drug because that would be bad. And so there's a lot of debate. But so people back in the psychoanalytic days were thinking about this, but modern psychology, which is very behavioral and psychopharmacological, it's not really mental anymore. It's not deep. It's not a lot of depth psychology anymore. They've forgotten a lot of that stuff. So it was around, but it was forgotten. And now with the psychedelic renaissance, it's starting to come back.
Well, and when I think about, again, in my limited study, what alcohol produces and people who use alcohol long-term and the results of that versus somebody like Ram Dass, who was a professor of psychology at Harvard, did a lot of study on LSD and psilocybin and mushrooms, and then created a place like the Center for the Dying in New Mexico, where he talks about we're all just walking each other home and I am loving awareness. Like the results of that kind of substance versus something like alcohol, those are two wildly different results.
Wildly different results. In the shamanic tradition, all substances, I think in the Shipibo have one that is sort of doesn't have a dark side, the tree of light, but most of them, they have a bright and dark side.
Sure.
So any substance you work with in these traditions, whether it's ayahuasca or psilocybin or alcohol, there's probably a side that's beneficial. Like a rescue dog, a big dog comes with a thing of brandy and you're starving in the snow. You're like, that's the best brandy I ever had. This is really healing. Yeah. But then these things easily become dark, and alcohol has huge. I mean, I quit drinking when I was 20. I'll be honest. it is not my it's not my substance of choice, and I think it can be harmful. It can be wonderful too, you know, but and psychedelics can knock people out, and they can be very risky too, but they're very healing as well.